the voice of endless freedom, and the prisoner of a captive mind, the man who wrote the hymn to the open road and who died alone on a lonely slope at the age of 27. He was Blind Owl, a genius mind that could hear and recreate the past, a great music preservationist. But he was also a broken soul, tormented by depression and an unquenchable loneliness. Ironically, his fateful song, On the Road Again, was not a promise of hope. It was a grim prophecy, a pre-written obituary. He was on the road and never returned. His name was Alan Wilson. This was not just another tragedy of the 27 Club. Here is the cruelest question about the price of sensitivity. Is genius a gift or an inescapable curse? Going back in time to America in the 1940s and 1950s, a time of turmoil and hidden contradictions. It was a world recovering from the shock of World War II, where the American dream was being reborn. But at the same time, social rifts and personal pressures also existed. America was searching for stability, order, after the chaos of war and economic depression. Traditional values, expectations of a normal and stable life, were still very strong in middle-class families. However, under the cover of that normalcy, a new chaos was beginning to emerge. It was the desire for individual freedom, the desire to escape from stereotypes, the desire for difference. Alan Wilson, from the moment he was born on July 4th, 1943, in Arlington, Massachusetts, a day filled with symbolic significance for the 4th of July, was caught between these two opposing worlds. He was a boy born on a day that celebrated freedom, but his destiny was a constant internal struggle to find his own freedom. The Wilson family was middle class with a solid academic background. This was not a poor family struggling to make ends meet. On the contrary, they were people who valued knowledge, education, and spiritual values. An environment filled with books, serious discussions, and a clear preference for logical thinking and a stable career over emotional outbursts. His father, a man of learning, may have instilled in Alan a passion for knowledge, but at the same time he also instilled an invisible pressure, the pressure to be intelligent, to be outstanding, to be useful in a certain mold. This was a rather closed family context where the expression of emotions could be considered weak or inappropriate. That environment, while possibly promoting Alan's intellectual development, inadvertently stifled his ability to express emotions, his ability to connect socially. It created a latent family conflict between what was considered intellectual, that is, academic excellence, logic, seriousness, and normal, that is, simple social interactions, ease in communication, the natural expression of emotions. Alan Wilson, an extremely sensitive and intelligent child, grew up in the narrow gap between these two concepts. Family tragedy began early, deepening the rift in Alan's soul. His parents divorced when Alan was very young, leaving a huge void in the child's heart. He lived with his father and grandmother, creating a family triangle with complex dynamics and possibly lacking the warmth and understanding of a full home. Imagine a child facing family breakdown, the absence of a mother figure, in an environment where intellect is valued over emotion. It instilled a sense of insecurity, a fear of abandonment, and a deep longing for connection that he never really found easily. And Alan, from the start, was a different child, abnormal in unexpected ways. He was so nearsighted that he had to wear thick glasses from a young age. The glasses not only distorted his young face, but also reduced his vision of the world to a series of blurry, indistinct images. This not only made it difficult physically, reading, playing sports, or even just recognizing faces, but also created a huge psychological barrier. Eye contact became difficult, the world around him seemed alien, unattainable and sometimes frightening. It was those thick glasses, along with his habit of squinting to see the world around him, that earned him the nickname Blind Owl. The nickname, which later became affectionate and became part of his identity in the music world, was actually a scar from his lonely childhood. It was not glaucoma or blindness in one eye, as many people mistakenly believe. It was a symbol of his difficulty seeing, his lack of connection with the outside world, his separation from what was considered normal. It was a silent reminder of his inborn difference, of how he never quite fit in. The isolation of his youth profoundly shaped Alan Wilson. He was an introverted boy, often lost in his own world, in his own thoughts and feelings. While other children played noisily, Alan sought refuge in another place, a world where he could freely explore and express himself. Music, blues in particular. He was fascinated by the raw, emotional, sometimes heartbreakingly sad sounds of local Boston radio stations Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, Sonny Boy Williamson II. These names were more than musicians. They became Alan's invisible confidants, voices echoing from another world, a world in which he felt he belonged. The blues provided him with a strange comfort, an outlet for his repressed emotions. At the same time, his family loved classical music, a completely different world, one of solemnity, perfect harmonic structures, and strict rules. A world of Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, where every note had its place and meaning, where emotions were expressed through predetermined patterns. Imagine little Alan caught between two worlds, the chaotic blues, full of instinct and pain, and the strict order of classical symphonies, which demanded absolute precision. This was the first crack, the seed of the intellectual and emotional conflict that would tear him apart later. He was a child with a huge symphony orchestra and a dark, smoky blues bar. He craved the freedom of the blues, but was also drawn to the perfection and control of classical music. This contrast was more than just a musical preference. It was a reflection of his own inner struggle. It could be said that the stark contrast between a strict intellectual environment, where emotion often overshadowed reason, where normal was defined by stability and academic success, and the burning desire for freedom in the blues, sowed the seeds of his later musical style. It blended academics, deep sadness, and an indescribable spiritual obsession into every note. Alan's music was more than just sound. It was a manifesto of a man's inner struggle. That childhood of silence and isolation created something special, a different energy. It was not the loud rebellion of a delinquent. It was a haunting sound. On Alan's harmonica from the mid-1950s, he began to teach himself and play harmonica in small bands around the Boston area where the blues culture was still very strong. Although he was not a star or a flashy performer, his reputation in the local blues scene quickly spread. It was said that he had a virtuoso technique, the ability to control the harmonica in a delicate and unique way, but more importantly, he had a special feeling, a haunting quality in each note that made it unforgettable to the listener. His harmonica was more than just music. It was the voice of a lonely man trying to find connection, understanding. It was as if he had turned all his loneliness, all his difficulty in communicating, into another language, an art that transcended words. When Alan played, it seemed that all barriers of communication, all feelings of isolation disappeared, leaving only the purest, most honest sound of a soul speaking. That was where he turned loneliness into art, turned weakness into strength. There is a small story, little known, but it reveals a lot about the nature of Alan Wilson. It is not a flashy anecdote about rock and roll, but a quiet slice of his inner life. Friends and acquaintances from that time often recount that Allen, even as a budding musician, would frequent libraries and record stores, not just to listen, but to study the blues seriously and obsessively. He was not just an amateur musician. He was an unofficial blues historian, a self-styled music archivist. He would sit for hours meticulously analyzing every nuance in Muddy Waters' playing, every note bend of Sonny Boy Williamson II, every harmonic structure of Blind Lemon Jefferson. Allen listened not only with his ears but with his mind, with a scientific passion that bordered on obsession. This was his intellectual, an aspect we must emphasize to understand the later tragedy. While others listen to music for entertainment, to feel, Allen listens to decode, to deeply understand its structure, history, and soul. This meticulousness, this super analytical ability is an indispensable part of the order in his mind. He is an analytical genius, able to dissect a piece of music into its smallest components, understand its origin and evolution. But this obsessive focus is also a double-edged sword. It makes him more isolated from the real world, more immersed in the world of sounds, dry analysis, old books and records. Instead of warm and real human interactions, he finds solace and meaning in the 12-bar structures of the blues, in sad stories told through music, rather than in the eyes of another person in a simple conversation. Can you imagine what it must be like for a man who sees the world through thick glasses, who is often misunderstood or feels awkward in social interactions, to find solace only in a classic blues? It is a loneliness cleverly disguised as intelligence and academic passion. He does not merely study music. He escapes into it, creating an invisible wall between himself and the outside world. His loneliness is not emptiness, but a voluntary isolation where he is both king of his own musical kingdom and its prisoner. This was the solid foundation for Allen Wilson's personal tragedy. A musical genius was emerging, but also a fragile soul filled with internal conflicts. Between the order of intellect and the chaos of repressed emotions, between the desire for connection and the fear of rejection, between brilliant talent and deep insecurity. He was a genius, but also a person who always felt that he was not good enough, not normal, according to society's expectations. These seeds, planted in childhood, would germinate and grow, eventually leading to a tragic ending that the music world would forever regret. Allen Wilson's world, that quiet, academic, and deeply isolated world of dusty record bins and solitary harmonica practice in Boston, was a pressure cooker, the order of his intellectual life, the rigorous study, the analytical mind, the introverted safety of his books, was building an immense unspoken pressure. The chaos of his kept-in-check emotions, his profound loneliness, and the raw, untamed spirit of the blues he so admired was rattling the lid. Something had to give. A genius like this cannot stay hidden forever. He was a man with a profound, almost spiritual connection to a musical form that was, at its very core, about raw human expression, the very thing he found so difficult in his own life. The mid-1960s were not just a time of personal pressure for Allen, it was a time of cultural explosion. The folk revival was in full swing, and with it, a renewed, almost fanatical interest in the roots of American music. Young, white, middle-class kids, much like Allen, were discovering the raw, honest power of the Delta blues. It was a pilgrimage. They were searching for something authentic in a world that felt increasingly plastic and manufactured. For Allen Wilson, this was not a trend. It was a calling. He wasn't just a fan of the blues, he was a scholar. And it was this scholarly obsession that would, ironically, provide the very key to unlock his prison. In 1962, a group of young blues enthusiasts, including a man named Dick Waterman, had undertaken a pilgrimage of their own to the Mississippi Delta, their mission, to find the legendary bluesman, Son House, who had vanished from the public eye decades earlier. When they found him, he was an old man, living in obscurity in Rochester, New York, unaware that a new generation was desperate to hear him. This is where Alan Wilson, the 21-year-old academic misfit from Boston, enters music history. Son House was a legend, but he was rusty. He hadn't played seriously in years. He couldn't remember how to play his own songs, the very songs that had defined the Delta sound. The young revivalists were heartbroken. They had found the oracle, but the oracle was silent. And then Alan Wilson stepped in. Alan, the blind owl, the kid who had spent thousands of hours not just listening to Son House's 1930s and 40s recordings, but dissecting them. He sat down with the master. And then one of the most surreal moments in music history happened. The 21-year-old bespectacled white intellectual kid began to teach Son House how to play his own music. Think about that. The sheer staggering audacity. The intellectual order of Alan Wilson's mind had so perfectly preserved the chaos of Son House's past that he could literally give it back to him. He could play the riffs, note for note. He could explain the tunings. He was, in essence, a living, breathing archive. Son House himself was astonished. This quiet, awkward boy from the North knew his music better than he did. This act alone cemented Alan Wilson's reputation among the blues purists. He was not a dilettante. He was the owl. He was a high priest of the tradition. But this triumph was also a trap. He was a master of other people's chaos, but what about his own? He had proven his intellect, his order, but he was still trapped, still the awkward, lonely figure behind the thick glasses. He had all the technical knowledge in the world, but he lacked the one thing that defined the bluesman he worshipped, a voice. Not just a singing voice, but a life voice, a way to project, to connect, to be in the world. His intellect had taken him as far as it could. To truly live, he had to leave the library. He had to journey into the one place he feared most, the real, messy, chaotic world. And so he left. He migrated, like so many before him, to the place where dreams were made and broken. He went west to California. Los Angeles in 1965 was a different planet from the cloistered academic world of Boston. It was the epicenter of the new exploding counterculture. It was sun, it was psychedelics, it was free love, and it was a burgeoning music scene that was rewriting the rulebook daily. For a man like Alan Wilson, painfully shy, socially awkward, and constitutionally introverted, arriving in L.A. must have felt like being dropped onto the surface of the sun. He was the ultimate outsider, a fish out of water, a blind owl blinking in the relentless California light. He was in California ostensibly to help a friend, John Fahey, with his graduate thesis at UCLA. Again, the order, the academic pursuit, was his shield, his excuse, but the real reason he was there was the music. And it was here, in this sprawling, chaotic city, that he would have the single most important collision of his life. He would meet his perfect polar opposite. He would meet Bob the Bear Hite. If Alan the Owl Wilson was the embodiment of order and intellect, a small, quiet, scholarly man who lived inside his own head, Bob Hite was the walking, talking, breathing definition of chaos and emotion. Bob Hite was a mountain of a man, physically imposing, with a booming voice and a personality that could fill a stadium, let alone a room. He was a fellow blues fanatic, but his fanaticism was not the quiet, analytical obsession of Alan Wilson. Bob's obsession was loud, joyous, and all-consuming. He was a human encyclopedia of the blues, but he was also a born showman, a ringmaster, a true believer who proselytized the gospel of the blues with the fervor of a tent revival preacher. He was nicknamed the Bear for a reason. He was big, he was hairy, he was loud, and he had an insatiable, almost primal appetite for life, for music, and for the excesses that came with it. He was everything Alan Wilson was not. Where Alan was hesitant, Bob was decisive. Where Alan was shy, Bob was profoundly, almost aggressively confident. Where Alan studied the blues, Bob lived the blues. The story of their meeting is itself a piece of blues rock lore. They were both record collectors, scouring the same dusty bins in the same LA record shops. But it was at a gig, a local club, where their two orbits finally, fatefully collided. Alan was there, as always, observing, analyzing, a quiet shadow in the corner. Bob was there, as always, holding court, his voice booming over the music. They started talking about music, and in that moment, the owl and the bear must have recognized something in each other. It was the shock of recognition that only true, obsessive fanatics can share. But it was more than that. They were, without realizing it, the two missing halves of a perfect whole. Alan Wilson had the one thing Bob Haidt, for all his charisma, desperately needed: authenticity. Alan possessed the staggering, undeniable talent. He had the technical skill, the intellectual depth, and the almost spooky, ethereal connection to the soul of the old blues. He was the high harmony voice, the haunting harmonica, the intricate guitar work. He was the brain and the spirit. And Bob Haidt had the one thing Alan Wilson so profoundly lacked: a body, a voice, a presence. Bob was the front man, the translator, the man who could take Alan's dense academic and introverted order and sell it to the world with the joyous, infectious chaos of a rock and roll show. He was the heart and the body. This was not a friendship, but a necessary, brilliant, and ultimately dysfunctional symbiosis. Together, they decided to form a band. But this wasn't going to be just another band. This was a mission. Alan Wilson, in his first and perhaps only act of pure confident assertion, laid down the law. This would not be a pop group. This would not be a band that played at the blues. This would be a blues band, dedicated to the purest, most authentic sound. Their guiding principle, their very name, came from a 1928 song by Tommy Johnson called Canned Heat Blues, a song about a desperate alcoholic drinking sterno, or canned heat cooking fuel, to get high. It was a dark, gritty, and deeply authentic name. It was a statement of intent, and it perfectly captured the strange, desperate, and intellectual fire that fueled Alan Wilson. They needed a guitarist who could match Alan's technical obsession. They found him in Henry the Sunflower Vestine. Vestine was another mad genius, a brilliant, fiery guitarist who was himself a blues purist, obsessed with the rawness of B.B. King and Albert King. He was famously eccentric, a man who, legend has it, once set his own hair on fire just to see what it felt like. He was another outsider, another perfect piece of the puzzle. They recruited a rhythm section, first a revolving door of bassists and drummers, before solidifying with Larry the Mole Taylor on bass and later Fito de la Parra on drums. The name The Mole for Larry Taylor was, again, weirdly appropriate. Like Alan the Owl, it suggested a creature of the dark, a digger, someone who burrowed deep beneath the surface. This was not a band. This was a menagerie, a collection of brilliant, obsessive, and socially awkward misfits. You had the owl, the shy intellectual brain; the bear, the boisterous, charismatic body; the sunflower, the fiery, eccentric guitar; and the mole, the grounded, subterranean rhythm They were a freak show of blues fanatics. And at the center of it all, the two opposing poles keeping the entire unstable structure together were Alan and Bob. Their early days were a struggle. They were purists in a world that was moving towards psychedelic pop. They would play gigs, and Alan Wilson, in his uncompromising academic way, would be the musical director. He would stop the band mid-song if a chord progression was wrong, if it wasn't authentic. He would lecture them, and sometimes even the audience, on the historical significance of the song they were about to play. Imagine that. You're in a smoky LA club in 1966, ready for a good time, and this strange, bespectacled man with a high nasal voice gets on the microphone and starts giving you a college-level lecture on the migratory patterns of Mississippi Delta musicians. It was awkward. It was weird. It was painfully introverted. And then Bob the Bear Height would step up. He would grab the microphone, his voice booming, "Yeah, and this song kicks ass." And suddenly, the order of Alan's lecture was translated by the chaos of Bob's enthusiasm. Bob could take Alan's dense intellectual passion and make it fun. He made the academic accessible. But it was Alan who gave them their sound. That high, haunting vocal. It was, in fact, a result of him meticulously training his voice to sound like the high-pitched field holler. Sainton of the 1930s, bluesman, it wasn't a natural voice. It was a learned one. It was an act of profound intellectual mimicry. So perfect it became its own, unique, and deeply emotional instrument. It was the sound of his loneliness filtered through his academic brilliance. They were a local sensation, but they were also a local joke. Too weird, too nerdy, too pure. The music industry didn't know what to do with them. They were a band of order in an age that was celebrating chaos. Then in 1967 came the event that changed everything, the Monterey International Pop Festival. This was the moment the counterculture announced itself to the world. It was the event that launched Jimi Hendrix and The Who into the American stratosphere. And on that same bill, sandwiched between the psychedelic gods, was canned heat. They were, by all accounts, terrified. This was the big league, but they were also ready. They had been grinding, rehearsing Alan's authentic arrangements to perfection. They took the stage on Saturday afternoon, and the world got its first real look at this bizarre collection of musicians. And they saw Alan Blind Owl Wilson. He was strange. He stood there small and unmoving behind his thick glasses, looking more like a graduate student who had wandered onto the wrong stage than a rock star. He looked, as one critic noted, like he was apologizing for being there. And then he played. The moment Alan Wilson put the harmonica to his lips or stepped up to the microphone to sing, the awkward, shy student disappeared. What emerged was this sound, this haunting, ethereal, and technically brilliant wail that seemed to come from another time, another place. It was the sound of the old weird America, channeled through this bizarre, introverted vessel. And the audience, that massive crowd of love children, was mesmerized. They had never heard anything like it. It was Bob Height who worked the crowd, who boogied and shouted, who was the front man, but it was Alan Wilson who was the soul. Their performance at Monterey was a triumph. It wasn't the fiery, sacrificial lamb, rock god theater of Hendrix or Townshend. It was something deeper, weirder, and in its own way more revolutionary. It was the moment the intellectual proved he could be just as powerful as the emotional. The record labels, who had previously dismissed them as too nerdy, were suddenly in a bidding war. They signed with Liberty Records, and their first self-titled album was released almost immediately. It was a solid, powerful blues purist album. It did well. It established their credentials. It got them on the map. But fame was a different animal. The chaos they had invited into their lives was no longer just a musical concept. It was now a reality. And for Alan Blind Owl Wilson, a man who had spent his entire life building walls of order to protect his fragile inner self, those walls were now under assault. The pressure was immediate. The grind of touring, the parties, the drugs, the expectations, the fans. For Bob Haidt, this was paradise. He thrived on the chaos. He was the bear, and this was his forest. But for Alan the Owl, it was a nightmare. He was a creature of the quiet, of the night, of the library, and he was now being forced to live in the broad, blinding, noisy daylight of rock stardom. The very thing he loved, the blues, was now part of a machine that demanded he perform not just musically, but socially. He was expected to be a rock star, and this was a role he was constitutionally, psychologically, and emotionally incapable of playing. His old defenses, his intellectualism, his shyness, were no longer seen as charming quirks. In the high-stakes world of rock and roll, they were seen as liabilities. He was seen as difficult, moody, unreliable. His profound lifelong social anxiety and his deepening undiagnosed depression were now being exacerbated by a lifestyle that was pure poison for his particular mind. The V-neck in his family, the conflict between intellectual and normal, was now being played out on a global stage. The intellectual had created this incredible music, but the normal world of fame was demanding a personality he simply did not possess. He was becoming more reclusive, even within the band. He would retreat, he would write. He was searching desperately for a way to express this new terrifying pressure. He was searching for a new song, and he found it. He found a way to take all of his old obsessions, the blues, the road, the feeling of being an outsider, and merge them with this new terrifying reality. He took a 1950s blues tune by Floyd Jones, itself based on an older tune by Tommy Johnson, and he began to re-engineer it. He kept the order of the tradition, but he injected it with the chaos of his own modern psychological dread. He was no longer just studying the blues, he was living his own. And the song he was crafting, the song that would launch Canned Heat into the stratosphere, and in doing so seal his own tragic fate, was a song called On the Road Again. The stage was set for the pinnacle and for the fall. By 1968, Canned Heat was a finely tuned, if profoundly unstable, machine. They had survived the trial by fire of Monterey. They had a record deal. They had a cult following. But they were still a band of purists, a band of intellectuals. In a world that was increasingly demanding hits, the order of their academic blues roots was about to clash with the chaos of the commercial music industry. And it was Alan Blind Owl Wilson, the band's quiet, anxious, and brilliant soul, who would have to bridge that gap. The band's second album, Boogie with Canned Heat, was their commercial breakthrough. It was a masterpiece of compromise in the best possible way. It was Bob the Bear Haidt who gave the album its name and its public-facing, joyous party-time identity. But it was Alan Wilson who gave it its strange, haunting, and unforgettable heart. He was now writing, not just arranging. And the two most important songs of Canned Heat's career, the two songs that would define them forever, are a perfect, almost terrifying X-ray of his internal psychological war. These two songs are On the Road Again and Going Up the Country. And we must analyze them, not just as hit singles, but as two sides of the same fractured, brilliant mind. First, there was On the Road Again. As we discussed, this song was not a pure original. It was a synthesis, an act of profound intellectual re-engineering. Alan took the framework of a 1950s song by Floyd Jones, which itself was based on a 1920 song by Tommy Johnson. This was the order part. This was Alan the Owl, the academic, paying his dues to the tradition, showing his work, citing his sources. But what he did with it was pure modern chaos. He introduced a psychedelic single-note droning tambura effect that runs through the entire track. This wasn't a blues instrument. It was an Indian one. It immediately lifted the song out of the Mississippi Delta and placed it firmly in the summer of love. It was a brilliant intellectual fusion. But the real genius, the real autobiographical confession, is in the vocal and the harmonica. Alan chose to sing this song himself, and the voice that emerges is not the booming, confident growl of a blues shouter like his partner, Bob Haidt. It's this high, thin, spectral wail. It's the sound of his loneliness, his anxiety, his otherness, broadcast to the world. He's not singing to you, he's singing past you like a ghost whispering in your ear. It was the field holler voice he had perfected, a sound of pure, unadulterated alienation. And then, the lyrics. He sings, "Well, I'm so tired of crying, but I'm out on the road again." This is not a celebration. This is a confession of weariness. This is not the joyous freedom of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. This is the grim, repetitive, exhausting compulsion of a man who cannot stop moving, because to stop moving would be to face himself. Listen to the very first lines. "Well, I'm so tired of crying, but I'm out on the road again. I ain't got no woman just to call my special friend." This is the blind owl speaking. This is the man who struggled with social interaction, the man who felt disconnected, the man who, despite being in a world-famous band, felt utterly, profoundly alone. The road isn't a place of adventure. It's a place of escape. It's a place where he doesn't have to connect, where he can remain the perpetual, transient observer. And the harmonica solo? It's not a joyous, chugging, train time solo. It's a high, piercing, mournful cry. It's the sound of his anxiety, the sound of his internal noise given an instrument. When On the Road Again was released in April 1968, it was a massive, unexpected hit, climbing to number 16 on the Billboard charts. The world heard a hypnotic, cool, psychedelic blues rock track. But what Alan Wilson had actually written was a suicide note. In code, he had written the anthem of the intellectual outsider, the song of the perpetual refugee, the man who is always leaving because he never felt he belonged anywhere in the first place. He had taken the chaos of his profound personal depression and masked it with the order of his academic blues structure. The success was validating, but it was also terrifying. Millions of people were now dancing to the sound of his private pain. The machine was now in full gear. Liberty Records, smelling money, wanted another hit. The pressure on the band, and specifically on its strange introverted hitmaker, was immense. If On the Road Again was Alan's confession of his bleak reality, the next song he wrote would be his vision of a desperate fantasy. This song was Going Up the Country. Once again, Alan the Owl went back to the archives. The order. He based the song's melody and structure on a 1920s blues track by Henry Ragtime, Texas. Thomas called Bulldoze Blues. He even adapted the signature flute-like melody, originally played by Thomas on quills, and had session musician Jim Horn replicate it on a flute. This was pure intellectualism, a direct scholarly nod to the past. But the lyrics were all Alan, and they are the complete polar opposite of On the Road Again. Where On the Road Again was dark, lonely, and compulsive, I'm so tired of crying. Going Up the Country is bright, communal, and filled with a desperate, almost childlike optimism. I'm going up the country, baby, don't you want to go? I'm going up the country, baby, don't you want to go? I'm going to some place where I've never been before. This is not a song about running away from something. It's a song about running towards something. It's a fantasy of escape, a utopian dream. He sings, we're gonna jump and shout, and we'll be, well, all right. This is Alan Wilson's personal Garden of Eden. It's a fantasy of a place where he can finally be all right. A place with no one there to tell me what to do. A place of pure freedom, not just from the music industry, but from the crushing expectations of the normal world he had fled his entire life. And this time, the field holler voice he uses is not a cry of alienation. It's a call of invitation. It's hopeful. It's a plea. Baby, don't you want to go? He is for a brief, shining moment trying to connect. He is asking the world to join him in his fantasy because he is too afraid to go there alone. This song, this beautiful, fragile, pastoral dream, became Canned Heat's biggest hit, climbing to number 11 on the charts, and in August of 1969 it became something much, much more. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair. 500,000 people gathered on a farm in upstate New York. It was the absolute zenith of the counterculture, the high water mark of a generation. And on Saturday, August 16th, as the sun was beginning to set, Canned Heat took the stage. They were by this point one of the biggest bands in the world, and they were a complete, utter mess. The endless touring, the drug use, the profound internal tensions, it had all taken its toll. The chaos was now completely overwhelming the order. The band was fracturing. Just a month earlier, their other mad genius guitarist, Henry the Sunflower Vestine, had a full-blown meltdown, allegedly threatening Bob Haidt with a gun, and had been fired or quit. The stories vary. He was replaced by the incredibly talented but far more conventional Harvey Mandel. The band that walked onto the Woodstock stage was exhausted, paranoid, and running on fumes. But they were also professionals, and they had an anthem. Their set was a powerful driving boogie blues marathon. Bob the Bear Haidt was in his element, a massive, sweaty, charismatic preacher exhorting the 500,000-strong congregation to boogie. And then they played Going Up the Country. The sun was setting. The entire massive, muddy, beautiful crowd began to move. As one, the film footage is iconic, and at the center of it, small, unmoving, almost invisible behind his glasses, is Alan Blind Owl Wilson. He steps up to the microphone, and that high, yearning, spectral voice cuts across the sea of humanity. I'm going up the country, baby. Don't you want to go? In that one perfect, crystallized moment, Alan Wilson's private, introverted fantasy, his dream of escaping to a place where he could be all right, was co-opted. It was no longer his fantasy. It became the fantasy of an entire generation. It became the unofficial anthem of Woodstock, the defining sound of the Back to the Land movement, the ultimate hippie dream. Can you imagine the psychological dissonance? Can you imagine being Alan Wilson at that moment? This painfully shy, socially anxious, clinically depressed man watching his most personal, fragile dream of escape being broadcast to 500,000 people, and by extension to the entire world via the subsequent documentary film. It must have been the single most alienating, terrifying, and profoundly lonely moment of his entire life. He had become a global superstar. He was the voice of a generation. He was the man who had written the anthem of hope for the biggest cultural event of the 20th century. He was at the absolute dizzying pinnacle of his success, and he had never been closer to the edge. The applause of 500,000 people must have sounded to his ears like a deafening, terrifying roar. He had given them his fantasy, and now he had no place left to hide. The aftermath of Woodstock was not a victory lap. It was a spiral The canned heat machine, now a global entity, demanded more. More tours, more hits, more boogie. And the conflict between the band's two poles, Alan the Owl and Bob the Bear, was reaching a breaking point. This was not a simple, petty rock star feud. This was the original core conflict of Alan Wilson's life, intellectual versus normal. Played out in real life. Bob the Bear. Height represented the normal world, or at least the rock star version of it. He loved the chaos. He loved the boogie, the parties, the women, the adulation. He was a showman. He wanted the band to be a good time band. He saw the music as a vehicle for connection and celebration. Alan the Owl Wilson represented the intellectual world. He was the purist. He saw the music as a vehicle for preservation and expression. He was becoming increasingly frustrated with the boogie formula. He wanted to go deeper, to explore the darker, more academic roots of the blues. He wanted to write songs about his growing passion, environmentalism. Yes, in the midst of this rock and roll chaos, Alan Wilson, the owl, the academic, was becoming a passionate conservationist. He wrote a song called Poor Moon, a quiet, mournful, and beautiful plea to save the moon from human colonization. It was released as a single. It was complex, strange, and deeply personal, and it completely bombed. The label, the fans, the world, they didn't want the intellectual environmentalist Alan. They wanted the going up the country Alan. They wanted the boogie. They wanted the fantasy. They did not want the reality. This rejection must have been devastating. He was once again the outsider kid in his own family. The intellectual was being told his ideas were too weird, that he should just shut up and be normal. He was being forced to play the hits, to play the role of the happy hippie from Woodstock, while inside he was screaming. His depression, which had been a lifelong companion, now became an all-consuming monster. He was drinking heavily. He was using barbiturates not for fun, but as a desperate attempt to turn off the noise in his head. He was trying to medicate the chaos that his intellect could no longer order. He became, in the words of his bandmates, a ghost. He would show up to gigs, play his parts with a terrifying mechanical precision, and then vanish. He was physically present, but the Alan Wilson who had taught Son House, the Alan Wilson who had dreamed of going up the country, was already gone. He was on his own, final, desperate road again. His bandmates, who were deep in their own spirals of drug and alcohol use, were helpless. They were a band of misfits, and their leader, their owl, was now flying directly into the sun. They saw the signs, but they were, in the tragic, blunt language of rock and roll, too wasted and too dysfunctional to know what to do. Bob Height, the bear, would later be haunted by this. He felt, as he later admitted, that they had all, in some way, killed him by not knowing how to save him. His defenses had crumbled. The chaos was all that was left. The year 1970 began not with a sense of new promise, but with a palpable air of dread. The bright, optimistic dream of the 1960s was over, and the come-down was brutal. The going up the country fantasy of Woodstock had been shattered just 4 months later by the horrific, murderous violence of the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. The chaos had finally shown its true terrifying face, and for Alan Blind Owl Wilson, a man whose entire nervous system was already a raw, exposed wire, this shift was more than he could bear. He was, by all accounts, a man who was already gone. He was a shell. He continued to tour and record with Canned Heat, but his presence was spectral. The band, his brothers, the Bear, the Mole, and Fito de la Parra, watched helpless as their owl was fading. He was retreating further and further into the one place no one could follow him, the intricate, collapsing labyrinth of his own mind. His depression was no longer a passing mood. It was a profound, clinical, and all-consuming illness. He was drinking heavily, and his use of barbiturates, specifically Seconal, had escalated from a tool for sleep into a desperate daily attempt to anesthetize his own existence. He was, in the starkest terms, trying to chemically induce the order and silence that his brain could no longer provide naturally. But in this final agonizing year, his brilliant intellectual mind latched onto one last desperate cause. It was a cause that was, in itself, a perfect, tragic metaphor for his entire life. Alan Blind Owl Wilson became a passionate environmentalist. He wasn't just interested in nature, he was obsessed with it. He poured his remaining energy into a new mission, the preservation of the giant redwood trees in California. He started a foundation, the Music Arts and Conservation Foundation, to raise money. He wrote articles. He tried to rally the rock community. Think about this. Here was a man whose own internal world was collapsing, whose own life was being clear-cut by depression and addiction, and his final, coherent act was to try and save something else from being destroyed. He was trying to impose order on the chaos of the outside world because he had so utterly failed to do so on the inside. He was trying to save these ancient, giant, silent, and stoic outsiders, these redwoods, perhaps because he saw himself in them. They were, like him, magnificent, awkward, out of time, and threatened by a world that didn't understand them. This wasn't a hobby. This was a transference. His environmentalism was the last coherent act of his intellectual self, a final noble plea for preservation. But it was too little, too late. The internal chaos was winning, and it was winning decisively. The spiral was accelerating. In the months leading up to September 1970, Alan's behavior became increasingly erratic and reclusive. The band was recording a new album with their former guitarist, the Sunflower, Henry Vestine, who had returned to the fold, but Alan was barely present. Then the warning shot was fired, the one that, in a functioning, healthy group of people, would have stopped everything. Sometime in the late summer of 1970, Alan Wilson attempted suicide. The details are murky, blurred by the fog of rock and roll trauma, but the event is not. He was so profoundly depressed, so lost in his barbiturate haze, that he tried to drive his car off a winding canyon road. It was a failed attempt. He was not seriously injured, but he was institutionalized. He was placed in the psychiatric ward of a local hospital for observation. Let's be clear. This is not rock star lore. This is a medical emergency. The blind owl, the intellectual genius of Canned Heat, the voice of Woodstock's biggest anthem, was now a psychiatric patient, deemed a danger to himself. The band was horrified. But what could they do? This was 1970. The language of mental health, intervention, and addiction treatment barely existed, especially not in the hyper-macho, keep-the-party-going world of rock and roll. The band's manager, Skip Taylor, allegedly got him out of the hospital, fearing it would be a bad look, that it would jeopardize their upcoming tours. Alan was released, but nothing was solved. He was simply put back into the machine. He was put back into the very environment that was destroying him. He was a man who had just screamed for help in the most dramatic way possible, and the world, his band, his family, essentially told him to get back on stage. He was now a dead man walking. The owl was flying on broken wings, and he was just looking for a final quiet place to land. He found that place on September 3rd, 1970. The night before, Canned Heat had returned from a European tour. They were scheduled to fly to Germany the next day for another festival. The machine was, as always, still grinding. Alan did not go home. He did not go to a hotel. Instead, he drove his van up into the winding, chaparral-covered hills of Topanga Canyon. This was the rustic bohemian enclave just outside Los Angeles where many musicians lived, including Bob Haidt. It was, in a very real sense, the closest thing to the country that existed in his world. He parked his van, he took his sleeping bag and his barbiturates, and he walked up a small private dirt road onto the hillside behind Bob Haidt's house. He was, in his final act, literally going up the country. But this was not the joyous communal fantasy of his song. This was not a plea for connection. This was a solitary, final, and deeply personal retreat. He was returning to nature, the one thing he had tried to save, the one thing he perhaps felt understood him. He got into his sleeping bag. He lay down under the open sky, and he took the pills. The next day, when Alan didn't show up for the drive to the airport, the band grew worried. Their roadie, the one who knew Alan best, had a sick feeling. He went up the hill behind Bob Haidt's house, and he found him. Alan Blind Owl Wilson was dead, lying peacefully in his sleeping bag on the side of a hill overlooking the canyon. He was 27 years old. This scene, this is the key to his entire life and death. This was not a rock star death. This was not a chaotic overdose, a violent, messy end in a sordid hotel room with needles and broken bottles. No, this was a curated death. It was a methodical death. It was, in its own heartbreaking, tragic way, an act of order. This was the intellectual deciding, it is finished. He had chosen the place, he had chosen the method. He had chosen to be alone in nature. He had, in essence, arranged his own death with the same meticulous, academic precision that he used to arrange a Son House song. The order of his intellectual mind had finally and permanently silenced the unbearable chaos of his emotional life. The owl, a creature of the night, had simply decided not to face another day. The official coroner's report was blunt: acute barbiturate intoxication. The cause of death was an overdose, but the manner of death? This is where the controversy, the historical argument, still rages. Was it accident or suicide? The argument for accident is plausible. Alan was a known heavy user of reds, Seconal. His tolerance was high. He was, by all accounts, depressed and exhausted from the tour. It is entirely possible that, in his exhausted, intoxicated state, he simply miscalculated. He took too many trying to find the order of sleep and accidentally found the order of death. Many in the canned heat camp to this day prefer this version. It is softer. It is less tragic. It is normal. But the argument for suicide is tragically overwhelming. This was not a miscalculation. This was a decision. His profound documented clinical depression, his extreme social isolation, his deep-seated outsider complex, and most damning of all, his previous documented suicide attempt just weeks earlier. This was not a man who slipped up. This was a man who had already announced his intentions. The failed car crash was the chaos attempt. The quiet, peaceful overdose in the sleeping bag was the order attempt. And the owl, the meticulous planner, finally got it right. His death was a profound, deafening shock. But the most terrifying part, it was just the beginning. Alan Wilson died on September 3rd, 1970. Just 15 days later, on September 18th, Jimi Hendrix would be found dead in London, also from an overdose of barbiturates. Just 1 month after that, on October 4th, Janis Joplin would be found dead in a Los Angeles hotel from a heroin overdose. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones had died a year earlier, also at 27. But it was this dark 3-week span in 1970 that forever cemented the grim, morbid mythology of the 27 Club. Alan Wilson, the shy, awkward intellectual owl, was the first domino to fall in that terrible autumn. He was the forgotten first victim, the quiet, academic one who didn't fit the fiery rock god narrative of Hendrix or the tortured blues mama narrative of Joplin. His death was quieter, stranger, and in many ways sadder. He wasn't a live fast, die young cliche. He was a think hard, die young tragedy. The immediate aftermath for Canned Heat was a trauma from which they would never, ever recover. The band was shattered. The bear had lost his owl. The body had lost its brain. The heart had lost its soul. Bob Haidt, in particular, was devastated. He was now the sole custodian of the band they had built together, and he was haunted by his partner's last words. According to music historian Spencer Lee and others, in the final dark days, Alan had made a plea to Bob. It was a secret, a final request, a dying wish from one blues scholar to another. He made Bob promise to keep the blues alive. This is the final heartbreaking piece of the order. Alan knew he was leaving. He knew he couldn't survive, but his intellectual self, his mission, could. He was passing the torch. He was, in his final act, entrusting his life's work, the preservation of the blues, to his opposite, his friend, his partner, the bear. This was Alan's real legacy. Not going up the country, not Woodstock, but a private whispered plea, "Don't let the order die with me." The band was now faced with an impossible choice. How do you continue when your soul is gone? But they had a promise to keep, and they had contracts to fulfill. The machine, as always, demanded it. So just 2 days after Alan Wilson's funeral, Canned Heat was back on stage, fulfilling a tour date. They had to. They were, in the most literal sense, keeping the blues alive. But it was a hollow, haunted version. They were a ghost of a band. Bob Haidt, now the undisputed leader, would carry that torch, that guilt, and that promise. For the next 11 years, he would become a man consumed by his partner's legacy, a man who, in his own way, was also destroyed by Alan's death. The bear would eventually follow the owl into the dark, dying of an overdose in 1981, his body finally collapsing under the impossible weight of the promise he had tried so desperately to keep. The intellectual was dead, but his intellectual mission had created a new, tragic chaos that would echo and kill for decades to come. A death like Alan Wilson's is not an ending. It is a detonation. It leaves a crater, and the shrapnel, the guilt echo, as the prompt so perfectly stated, travels for decades, wounding and in some cases killing those who were left behind. The story of Alan Wilson, the intellectual, does not end with his body in a sleeping bag on a Topanga hillside in 1970. To understand his legacy, we must first look at the man who was left to stand in the spotlight alone, the man who was given the impossible, whispered final command, "Keep the blues alive." This is the final tragic chapter of The Owl and the Bear. When Alan Wilson died, he took the soul of Canned Heat with him, but he left the body, and that body was Bob the Bear. Bob Haidt was now the sole custodian of a band that had become a monument. He was a frontman who had lost his backman. He was a showman who had lost his reason. He was the chaos now completely untethered from its balancing order. The bear, for all his booming confidence, was now navigating the woods alone, and he was haunted by the ghost of the owl. The band's decision to play a gig just 2 days after Alan's funeral is often cited as a cold, callous, the show must go on act of rock and roll greed. But the reality is far more complex and far more tragic. This was the bear, in his grief, doing the only thing he knew how to do. He couldn't think his way through the grief, as Alan would have. He had to act his way through it. He had to boogie. It was an act of defiance, an act of desperation. It was the normal man's attempt to process an intellectual's death, and he had the promise. Keep the blues alive. That promise, whispered from a dying man, was no longer a shared mission. It was a curse. It was a life sentence. For the next 11 years, Bob Hite would dedicate his entire existence to fulfilling that command. He became Canned Heat. He was no longer just a singer. He was a custodian, a curator, a high priest of a dead man's church. The band continued. They had to. They brought in new guitarists, new members. But Canned Heat, from 1971 onwards, was no longer a band. It was a tribute act to its own lost soul. They were a ghost in the machine. They were the bear forever performing a joyous boogie. But with the shadow of the owl looming over his shoulder, Bob Hite plunged himself into the chaos with a desperate fervor. He partied harder, played louder, trying to be the bear for both of them. He was trying to fill the profound silence Alan had left behind. But you cannot shout down a ghost. This was the guilt echo. Bob Hite and the rest of the band were survivors, and they were riddled with survivor's guilt. Why him? Why not me? Could we have done more? In Bob's case, it was a torment. He had been Alan's partner, his opposite, his protector in the rough and tumble normal world, and he had failed. The bear had failed to protect the owl from the one thing he couldn't see, the chaos inside Alan's own mind. So he boogied. He boogied his way through the 1970s, a decade that was increasingly unkind to 1960s blues rock bands. He kept the name Canned Heat alive, playing smaller venues, fighting for relevance, all in service of the promise. But the chaos he was using to keep the band alive was the same chaos that was killing him. On April 5th, 1981, almost 11 years after Alan's death, the curse finally came due. After a gig in Los Angeles, Bob Hite was offered a vial of heroin. He was not a heroin user, but he was a man of excess. He took it. He overdosed. His roadies tried to revive him, but it was too late. The bear, the big, booming, seemingly indestructible heart of Canned Heat, was dead at 38. This was not a separate tragedy. This was part 2 of Alan Wilson's death. The guilt echo had claimed its second victim. The man who was tasked with keeping the blues alive had been killed by the very chaos his partner had fled the owl, and the bear, the intellect, and the body, the order and the chaos, were finally and tragically reunited in death. The Canned Heat that the world knew was in that moment truly and completely finished. But here is the central, cruel, and beautiful irony. While the band Canned Heat was dying a slow, tragic death, Alan Wilson's songs were becoming immortal. His 2 most personal, most autobiographical works were detached from their creator and took on a life of their own. On the Road Again became the ultimate anthem for every road trip, every movie montage of freedom, every advertisement for a car or a pair of jeans. That hypnotic, paranoid drone, that spectral wail of a lonely outsider, was reinterpreted by the normal world as a cool, sexy, mysterious call to adventure. The song's deep, dark, introverted meaning was lost. Only its cool, psychedelic surface remained. And then there was Going Up the Country. This song, Alan's desperate, fragile fantasy of escape from the horrors of social anxiety and the pressures of the world, became the world's anthem. Through its inclusion in the Woodstock documentary, it became the defining soundtrack of the entire hippie generation. It was no longer Alan's private dream. It was the public property of millions. This is the ultimate tragic fate of the intellectual in a normal world. His most painful personal confession was completely, utterly, and joyously misunderstood. People heard Going Up the Country and felt joy. They felt connection. They felt communal hope. They had no idea it was written by a man who was incapable of feeling any of those things. They were dancing to a song about a party, written by a man who at every party was the quiet, awkward, terrified owl in the corner, wishing he were somewhere else. This is Alan Wilson's true legacy, and it is a profound paradox. His music achieved the one thing he never could in life. It connected with millions, effortlessly. His songs became the ultimate normal anthems, while their creator was the ultimate intellectual outsider. He gave the world the soundtrack for a party he was too sad, too shy, and too brilliant to ever attend. So when we conduct this final autopsy, what do we find? How do we summarize the life and death of Alan Blind Owl Wilson? He was not a typical rock star. He was not a cliche. He doesn't fit the live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse model of a James Dean or even a Jimi Hendrix. Alan was never good-looking in that conventional sense. He was weird. He was the blind owl. No, Alan Wilson's story is a different and perhaps more important cautionary tale. He is the archetype of the lost intellectual. He is the think hard, die young tragedy. His life is a case study in what happens when a profound, brilliant, and analytical mind, a mind of pure order, is chained to a profoundly sensitive, anxious, and depressive emotional state, a chaos it cannot control. And what happens when you take that fragile, unbalanced human being and drop him into the most chaotic, high-pressure, emotionally illiterate environment on planet Earth? The 1960s rock and roll machine. Alan Wilson was the canary in the coal mine. His death was a warning shot that no one heard because it was followed 15 days later by the much louder death of Jimi Hendrix. But Alan's death is, in many ways, the more complex and modern tragedy. Hendrix and Joplin died from the excesses of the chaos. They flew too close to the sun. Alan Wilson died from a lack of order. He died because his intellectual mind could not build a defense system strong enough to protect his emotional self from the world or from himself. This is why he is so relevant, perhaps more relevant, in 2025 than he was in 1970. Today, we have the language for Alan Wilson. We would see him and we would say, this man is suffering from clinical depression. This man has a crippling social anxiety disorder. Some experts and biographers have even speculated, looking at his hyperfocus, his obsessive interests, his intense discomfort with social cues, that he may have been on what we today call the autism spectrum. But in 1970, that language did not exist in the back of a tour bus. He wasn't on the spectrum. He was weird. He wasn't clinically depressed. He was moody. He wasn't having a panic attack. He was being difficult. His intellect, the very thing that made him a genius, was also his curse. It gave him the ability to analyze his own pain, but not the ability to stop it. He was a man who could see the order of a 12-bar blues progression, but could find no order in his own life. He was the blind owl, a man who could see in the dark, a man who could see the hidden histories in old records, but who was blinded by the bright, normal light of day. Which brings us back to that final secret plea to Bob Haidt, keep the blues alive. For years, that quote was taken literally. Keep the music genre alive. But after this autopsy, we can see it for what it truly was. It was a metaphor. The blues was Alan's word for truth, for authenticity, for the human soul. It was his order in a world of chaos. It was the academic, historical, intellectual truth that he had built his entire life around. Keep the blues alive was not a request to keep the boogie going. It was a dying man's plea: don't let the normal world win. Don't let the commercial machine, the record labels, the hit-making pressure destroy the one real, authentic thing. Don't let my order die with me. And this is the final heartbreaking paradox of his entire life. Alan Wilson, the intellectual who spent his life devoted to the preservation of this authentic, emotional chaos, was a man who could not ultimately live with his own. He could not live with the raw, painful, authentic blues inside his own heart, his own depression, his own loneliness. It was a chaos so profound that his intellectual mind saw only one orderly solution. He fled. He went up the country for the last time to a place where his blues, his unbearable, authentic, emotional self, could finally be silent. Today in 2025, Alan Wilson's legacy is at last being reevaluated. The guilt echo has faded. The bear and the owl are long gone, and we are left with the music, but we are also finally left with the story. The reissues of Canned Heat's material, the 2024 Boogie with Canned Heat, deluxe editions with unreleased tracks. These are not just marketing. They are archaeological digs. They are, at last, an attempt by the normal world to go back and understand the intellectual. We are no longer just listening to Going Up the Country. As a simple, happy anthem, we are now finally hearing it. We are hearing the blind owl in the high, lonely vocal. We are hearing the academic rigor in the flute line, lifted from Henry Thomas. We are hearing the order and the chaos in perfect tragic balance. We are, in effect, finally fulfilling Bob Haight's promise. We are keeping the blues alive. But we are keeping Alan's blues alive, the blues of the lost intellectual. Alan Blind Owl Wilson. He was not a rock god. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who gave the world its greatest party anthems. Written from the loneliest room in the world, he was the man who sang "On the Road Again" as a cry for help, and the world sang along thinking it was a song of freedom. His life is not a cautionary tale about drugs. His life is a cautionary tale about loneliness, about what happens when a brilliant, beautiful, and fragile mind is born into a world that is not equipped to understand it. He was a man out of time, a 1930s blues scholar in a 1960s rock star's body. He was the ultimate outsider. And his story, his music, and his high lonely cry will echo, haunt, and inspire for as long as there are those who feel like he did, on the outside, looking in.